I'm James Kelly, a BSN nursing student at Dominican University. I'm going to be presenting a personal statement followed by a land acknowledgement from Dominican University. I feel lucky to call Petaluma on Southern Pomo territory of Federated Indians of Grayton Rancheria home. I've been raised enjoying the many gifts this land offers. I remember the smell of growing up surrounded by fresh crab caught in the fall, earthy bright orange mushrooms in the early spring, and every now and then when I was younger, a grilled abalone or two. From Hetchy to Duncan's Cove, I've always been able to feel the spirit of the coastal Miwok and Sierra Miwok that have walked this land. I feel lucky to call this amazing piece of land home, but I know I'm a guest. I know there have been generations of horror and suffering before me. I know I must do my very best to make things better. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to Dominican University and the Museum of the American Indian and the Church of the Redeemer for filling the ears and opening the eyes of all students that pass through your doors. And here's a land acknowledgement from Dominican University to the coastal Miwok people of Marin County. Dominican University of California in San Rafael occupies the unceded ancestral lands of the past, present, and future coastal Miwok people and the coastal Miwok Tribal Council of Marin. We wish to acknowledge and respect the coastal Miwok, this land's original stewards, and honor the stolen land named Awanawi, the Red Ochre Basket. We acknowledge that the indigenous people had and continue to have a deep, sacred relationship with this land, and that the taking of this land was violent and destructive. We acknowledge that in colonization of California, the Catholic Church, especially through the mission system, and the early Spanish, Mexican, and American governments decimated indigenous peoples and attempted to eradicate their culture. Dominican University of California commits to an ongoing partnership with the coastal Miwok people through listening and learning, and seeks to honor and develop harmonious connections with indigenous people and this land.
I'd like to acknowledge that this series is made possible in part through grants from both the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Religion and Theology in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and also the Episcopal Church of the Redeemer in San Rafael.
Hi, my name is Victoria Cambier-Torrey. I'm the executive director here at the Museum of the American Indian, and it's nice to see some of the familiar faces that have been coming to these lunchtime series. I really feel fortunate that we've been able to collaborate and make these happen. And we are very fortunate today to have David Escobar, a friend, family of mine. And David is an amazing activist, a scholar. He identifies as Salvadoran from the Lenca-Poton Nation and has worked in Marin County for over 21 years and has actually attended the UN in New York for several years as an AIM delegate. And even I was fortunate to actually take one of the classes that David taught at Dominican University when I was there getting my master's in Native Perspectives. And he also taught Mayan Cosmology. So it's just, I feel really honored to have David here. And David, welcome.
Thank you, everybody. I'm really, really appreciative of being here. I first want to thank the Creator for the permission to be here and allow me to share my perspectives on the topics of resilience and reconciliation. I also want to ask permission of the Miwok and Ohlone ancestors for the permission to also be able to speak and be able to sort of give again my perspectives on these topics and share these things with you. And in my language, I want to say unamami kong katapi aria champaniang ibitia kasmokta champaniang ilanki champaniang ilanki kasmokta ilanki champaniang lempa champaniang lempa unamami kong lempa kas apanaisang turuve apanaisang kasa inchaling kang kasmokta nibitia champaniang Ohio. Thank you. So as Tori indicated, you know, I'm going to sort of give a couple of sort of disclaimers here that, some of these perspectives, some of them are mine, not necessarily exclusively mine, but sort of an accumulation of being able to have the privilege of, meeting different elders throughout my lifetime and learning from them, from the founders of the American Indian movement, who took me under their wing, to my elders both in Central America and South America, Canada, all over the United States, who I've been so privileged to learn from them, and the privilege of actually being an interpreter for them when they're here in town. So I've learned over the years, and I'm still learning. I'm a fledgling, I believe, when it comes to many of these things, as it relates to indigenous cosmologies and interpretations and perspectives on a whole vast variety of different things. My folks, the Lenca people, are from specifically 3 different nation states. So the nation states, when they were drawn, kind of came and were divided into 3 on our territories, from Honduras, El Salvador, and parts of Nicaragua. So we're located mostly on the eastern part of El Salvador and going into Tegucigalpa of Honduras. You may have heard a few years ago, one of the Lenca activists, Berta Cáceres, who I had the privilege of being with her and knowing her as a friend and as a fellow activist, was murdered in Honduras for her environmental activism. And so we encompass all those 3 nation states. So we've been, it's been interesting kind of meeting with the different nation states from our territories. And when we go to the United Nations and talk about, issues of policy and law, environmental issues as well. And so I think my own Lenca actually is the confederation. It's basically, Lenca means confederation or good way of living together, the term Lenca. And then Poton means our language. So, but it's more than that. It's not only our language, but also our being. The people who we are means, that's what Poton means. Who we are, our language, our vibration that comes out of our mouths is Poton. And so it's us, right? So, and there's many others. There's Uluas, there's Kakarawikas, the different tribal communities that come under the umbrella of Lenca. In terms of resilience, right? I think I'm going to talk a little bit about my story of resilience, but but I also have other thoughts on it. So for me, I grew up, and I won't go so much into my personal story, but I'll go into some. So I grew up in San Francisco, in the Mission District of San Francisco, in the Excelsior District. For a long time, I wasn't really, we were raised kind of like in this Catholic family, but yet my mom, my great aunt, had a lot of vestiges of indigeneity, Lenca ways of being and doing things that I really took for granted. And I really didn't care about that. For me, it was, growing up with gangsters was my forte, and that's what I really wanted to do and be. But the one interesting thing about resilience is you pick up kids. We pick up, when I was a kid, we pick up little bits and pieces, and they stay with you for a lifetime. So I was lucky that way to be able to continue to remember. Part of and I want to share this with you too, is that there was an elder that I know, and we were going to do a ceremony. It was actually a Mayan ceremony, and it was at his home. And he said, and I said, he goes, David, you have to go get these materials. We need this, we need that. And I'm like, yes, absolutely. I'll go get them. And, this was about, about 15 years ago. And I've been in sort of the indigenous activist movement for about 30 years and learning, from different communities. But 15 years ago, I was asked to begin to get materials for the ceremony. And the elder, and I was looking at basically I was looking at the weather. It was a Thursday, we were going to have the ceremony on a Friday. And I said, hey, are you sure that it's not going to rain? It looks like it's pretty damp. I think it's going to rain. And he said, it's not going to rain. And I'm like, wow, this elder is amazing. He knows it's not going to rain. And but then as, later on that day, a Thursday evening started rolling in, man, it was foggy. It was so damp. It was miserable. And I said to him, hey, I hate to bring this up again, but, I think it's going to rain. I hate, I don't want to disrespect you. But I think it's going to rain. And he's like, he looked at me very quietly, and he kind of looked and he goes, shook his head. He said, it's not going to rain. And I said, and I was looking up and I said, but can't you see? It looks like it's really going to rain. And so he goes, again, third time, he said, it's not going to rain. Don't worry. So in my mind, I said, my goodness, what an amazing medicine man this is. He's got this profound understanding of the land and the clouds and the atmosphere. It is so amazing, amazing. So my curiosity got poked, and I said to him, I hate to ask you, but how is it that you know these things? And he looked at me and he says, and he took his phone down, he goes, internet. He said, internet. And I said, the internet? He goes, yes, Google. And I go, oh my God, right? And it's a funny story because it kind of, in that same spirit, it's kind of showing a little bit of sort of even medicine people, are resilient, in finding different ways of even finding out about the weather for a ceremony. It was hilarious, and it really kind of, it actually made me reflect of sort of this romanticism, in regards to being with him, that even back then I had, like, wow, he knows the clouds, and mind you, there are elders that actually can read the clouds, they can read the atmosphere to a T. But and in that spirit, I want to sort of read sort of a Google Oxford Dictionary definition of resilience, and it says the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. And then there's another definition from Velasquez in 2009, says, quote, indigenous resilience is the innate determination of indigenous people to succeed rather than to overcome challenges, right? So that's really interesting, right? It's really more about success than just overcoming things, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about this whole how do we do that in the context of coloniality, right? Different from colonialism, we're trying to be resilient, to not only overcome but be successful in the context of coloniality. What does that mean? What it means and in terms of indigenous scholars and the decoloniality perspectives, we as indigenous people are still trying to prove our humanity, right? A long time ago, in the 15th century, the great Valladolid debate between Las Casas and Sepúlveda. The Bartolomé de las Casas was one of the priests that the friars that came over and was in Mexico, but one of the non-indigenous activists that began to talk about and write the Pope about what had occurred and what was occurring here in the Americas and the violence, etc. And whether or not, you know, indigenous people had souls or not, or were they animals, you know. Sepúlveda was the priest that was chosen by the Pope to actually begin to take on the con against Bartolomé de las Casas. And basically, there was a line of humanity that is drawn, right? There's this line of humanity that's drawn that some folks in the world are considered human beings, while others are not. And so we're still under this umbrella of, or that debate that Sepúlveda and Las Casas had. And why do I say that? Is because in order for us to be resilient, you know, we've had to deal with the debate of whether or not we're human or not. It's in that context that we as indigenous people are constantly trying to exhibit, right, our resiliency, right, to overcome things. But how have we become successful? There are maybe some manifestations of that, of our success. And I tell, you know, some of the students when I was at Dominican, and wherever, even at juvenile hall, where my other job is, that the mere fact of being born as and identifying as an indigenous person is a sign of not only resiliency, but also resistance and reconnection. The fact that we're born, because I think the idea was, you know, in that debate, you know, whether we're human or not, was by the looks of it and the way that the systems, the world systems have come together, we're still not human yet. And so that debate, we're, as Frantz Fanon says, we're in the zone of non-being. Those are the zone of being above the line of humanity, and indigenous people and other indigenous peoples around the world are still under the line of humanity. And that's why even Black Lives Matter, you know, even just the term itself, why don't Black lives matter? Why? Because they have not reached above the line of humanity. The debate is still going on. So on another note, if we move to looking at manifestations of resiliency, my brother last week was talking, Henry was talking about his journey, right, as an indigenous person, and how even while in prison, the correctional facility, he was still able to find that resiliency and success. I would say success. But we see these manifestations of resiliency through art, through music, continued narratives of changing the narratives. We see resiliency in politics, spirituality, recovery from drugs and alcoholism, food sovereignty. But in the end, you know, our resiliency is completely connected to the land. The bottom line is our resiliency has to be connected to the land. And so But on top of that, the other piece of this that's really critical too, is that if we are not connected to the land, we're also dealing with the psychological manifestations of coloniality to this day. Intergenerational trauma that has taken place, we're dealing with that still. And so if you think about it, if we are not connected to the land also embodies our culture, our spirituality, our values of spirituality that is connected to the land. But if we there's a severing of that, and you can look at this severing of this psychological trauma among many of the Latino community. Many folks, even the term itself, Latino, Hispanic, again, it's a re-traumatizing of peoples, of negating the invisibility, right, of indigeneity, right? Not having enough services in Maya or in Zapotec, Zapotec community, 70 to 80,000 Zapotec indigenous people living here in California. Marin, San Francisco, over 10 to 12,000 Maya, Yucatec Maya peoples who are learning how to speak Spanish in the United States because they never learned it in Mexico, right? But yet being brought under sort of a monolithic category of Hispanic or Latino, right? Or even Latinx, right? So again, we have to look at, as a community, we have to look at how do we mitigate all that has occurred, the massacres, the separation of indigenous people to the land, right? Even indigenous recognition by the federal government or non-recognition, right? Those issues are so critical in the United States, among a lot of indigenous nations and other communities, right? Latin America is a little different. There is recognition, but only to the point that it serves nation states in its romanticism for tourism, not necessarily the people themselves who still identify, who are who get taken off the land of the ancestors, right? For tourism purposes. It's very easy for tourists, and for example, in Mexico or Central America, where you see indigenous people begging next to the tourist spots of the pyramids, and yet the folks don't equate that indigenous person as related to the people who they're the ancestral structures that they're going to visit, and sort of look at them as the peasant farmer who just can't get their act together, right? So it's really interesting. This is the impact, right? So when we're talking about resiliency, it's not just resiliency, like how great manifestations of resiliencies are being shown throughout Indian country and in here in California. It has to go beyond that. It has to really sort of talk about resurgence, right? Persistence. It really is talking about persistence, resiliency, and persistence and resistance, right? They all have to come together. And that kind of, then we go into, potentially this this other notion of reconciliation, right? So that in and of itself, that has, before I go into that, I want to say this, that resiliency for every community is going to look different, right? And one of the things we cannot, again, sort of, and I don't want to generalize, but for a little bit, I am generalizing in terms of indigeneity, but every community has their own sense of resiliency, right? For some communities, resiliency is going to be focused more on XYZ versus ZWT, right? So So that has it's a dynamic and it's ongoing process. But again, we have to come back to resiliency as being part of and connected to the land, right? The land is really that's one of the critical pieces. And I would say that what is the resiliency that we're persisting to? And I come back to the notion of coloniality, right? So for those that are not familiar with the term, colonialism is when the empire, the metropole, the empire comes to a territory and then subjects the people, right, to the different normalities that, or imposed normalities to that particular community as being normal. This is the normal religion. This is the normal language. You cannot speak your language. You have to cut your hair. So all these normalities get imposed onto that territory. Coloniality is the aftermath, right? They talk about post-colonial. I'm not sure, that's another debate that I don't want to have here, but in and of itself, that's another controversial kind of thinking, right? Even saying post-colonial, has there ever been a post, or is coloniality really what we're looking for? Coloniality, once the empire leaves, then you're left with the colonial structures, right, that have been imposed, both actually physically, but also psychologically. We're looking at the psychological structures, right, that have been imposed, and the severing of connectivity to language, to ways of being and ways of knowing, right? So I would say that resiliency in this particular sense, and what Dominican and the Church of the Redeemer is doing, and the museum, is really the resiliency through indigenous resiliency through education, right? So we have to be a little bit more specific in that. So it's not just resiliency, but it's resiliency through education, right? And these are steps that that lead into reconciliation to some degree, because we can't have reconciliation without really becoming educated ourselves of the historical context in which we're still grappling with, right? So so that's resiliency. And just as a reminder, we're, this psychological trauma that indigenous people have had, assimilation, for example, we're almost left with with almost like a permanent acculturation, assimilation, if you want to even, that's another debate, right? Whether assimilation is even a forgotten term now, but the acculturation of it all. We're almost left with a permanent angst, a permanent state of alienation to the rest of society, right? And so some of these thoughts, come from my hero Tayagi Alfred, who's Mohawk out of Canada, who's been doing a lot of work with regards to decolonization and others. This psychological piece is major, right? When we're talking about resiliency, right? So, and again, we're seeing it. My brother last week, he's really has been successful to the extent that that this coloniality has allowed him and us to be here. So how do we bring this resurgence, right? So resurgence is another, opportunity that we have to reassert ourselves, right, in a very proactive kind of way. And so we have to look at, and again, we're doing all this within coloniality. Coloniality, we're navigating through the structures of the colonial system that are still in place and the normalities that have been created. And so if you think about it, it's like where we are as Indigenous people, generally speaking, as flowers that are blooming out of the concrete and the asphalt. That's how I see it. So if you think about concrete itself and asphalt, it is such a thick, hardened layer of matter that I just find it unbelievable. Sometimes when I'm walking down the street and I see a small daisy growing out of that concrete jungle, right? And so I see our Indigenous resiliency and success as that, right? As an example, right? And so if we, now let me turn over to reconciliation, right? So reconciliation means different things to different people. That's number one. Reconciliation from and I would say, and maybe my brother from the Church of the Redeemer can talk to me a little bit about this afterwards, but from a Christian theological perspective, it could mean an element of salvation that refers to the result of atonement, right? So there's that aspect of reconciliation. But if you think about it, how can there really be true reconciliation, right? Honest, authentic reconciliation when my brothers who are part of the Miwok Tribal Council are landless, right? How do we do that? How do we support their efforts, right? You know, beyond, you know, the educational and the Zoom kind of meetings, there's another level that we have to go beyond, right? And that's when you get into the tricky, sticky parts of all this, because in my view, when you start talking in terms of reconciliation to the nation state, you know, at that particular level, you're really talking about also the economic portion, right? That is connected to that, to the land, right? And I think that the feeling is that if Native peoples, if we give them back the land, then they're going to use the land specifically for capital gain, right? But that's not necessarily the truth. And that may not be so. So even the ways of our value systems, the way that folks interpret reconciliation is going to be quite different from all parties involved, right? So we have to begin to understand what it truly means to have reconciliation. And it's not necessarily just friendly friendly notions of, you know, or romantic notions that we all get along and hold hands. It's beyond that. Reconciliation, really, if we're really talking about authentic reconciliation, it's not the vision of acculturation or assimilation into the colonial structures. It's really, reconciliation is really allowing Indigenous people, my people in Central America, et cetera, to be free and to identify and do things that we once did, right? And so that's a whole different, you know, way of having folks maybe think about this term reconciliation, right? So there's, I think that, you know, there's also again, you know, the nation state. When I talk about reconciliation, I go to the UN and I'm thinking, that's my context, right? To part of this, right? It's not just friendly relations, right? It has to be, but we have to go beyond that. What that is for the Miwok Tribal Council is that's not for me to say. It's for my bros and my sisters from their perspective to chime in on it eventually with whoever will listen. But if you're talking about, but I think, you know, reconciliation and restitution, because reconciliation also has a restitution attached to it, right? And so where is the restitution? What does that mean? And I would venture to say from, and I'll take liberties to say in general terms, that restitution just doesn't mean giving a bunch of natives, a bunch of indigenous people, a bunch of stuff. It's not that. It's really it's much more. It's very complex because it's coloniality, and everything is permeated with this coloniality. So how do we restore, how do you bring restitution to the 500 years plus of severed connection to who we are? In some communities, the eradication of whole communities, the eradication of language, eradication of spiritual ways of being. How can there be restitution? So is it a non-starter from the very beginning in terms of reconciliation? I'm hopeful, you know, I think that, and a lot of other indigenous leaders around the world, and I would say, you know, I am, my elders from the Lenca perspective are very hopeful. The fact that we're going to the United Nations, the fact that we go there, we understand that the United Nations is a colonial tool. It's a colonial situation that we're navigating through. But it's also helpful to air out concerns, bring about the indigenous intelligentsia of the world, where we can convene and talk about these things. And I would say this is the United Nations, and is not our first, you know, as they say in the vernacular, rodeo. I want to tell you a story of the Tlaxcala people from Mexico, who from the very start, the Tlaxcalans and the Mexica people, or the Aztecs, they were never overcome by the Aztecs, the Tlaxcala people. As a matter of fact, they actually became allies with the Spanish against the Mexica. And they used the diplomacy. And if you want to call this resiliency, we might be able to. But they actually negotiated with the Spanish crown the land territory that today in Mexico, it's still called the state of Tlaxcala. They went on boats and they ventured to Spain, to the crown, and negotiated the land territories, the maintenance of the language, etc. And as a matter of fact, when settlers started coming into the Tlaxcala, the state of Tlaxcala, the Tlaxcala elders protested, and actually took the settlers to court, and in Spain. And guess what? Indigenous people prevailed in the courts of Spain, which for me was like mind-boggling. But this whole notion of international relations and international policy and bargaining was taking place, you know, in the 15th century. So, and if you want to call that a little bit of resiliency, I would venture to say, yeah, it's probably a type of political resiliency, where, again, still today, the state and the territory is the one that the Tlaxcala people negotiated with the Spanish crown. So, again, I think, let's see, it's 12:42. I think I'm gonna end there. I think that I got many stories and stuff, but I think I'm gonna end there. I could lecture for another 3 hours if you wanted me to, but I'm not gonna do that. Nor can I. But I'll end there and then maybe open it up for questions. What do you think, Tori or Emily?
That sounds good. You can use the raise hand feature on the reactions, or just unmute yourself and step forward with questions.
I have a question. It just, what have been, can you share with us some of the tools you've used in your life, a few of them that you felt have helped with your own personal resiliency?
Thanks for the question, Dina. So for me, it wasn't until I was able to connect to the community in the Mission District, where you had Aztec dancers and other activists talking about their own connection to connecting to their own indigeneity, which at the time, and I would publicly say, I was I'm formerly incarcerated, and I came out of that gang mentality, right? And but it was because of Indigenous activism that I was able to gravitate toward that, reconnect with my family, and my own family history, that then prompted me to actually be part of American Indian movement that took me under their wing, and started reconnecting with my Northern brothers, that then prompted me to have to connect with my own grandma's community back in Central America, and begin that process, right? And obviously, I'm also a U.S. guy, living here, raised here, and so, but in terms of resiliency, it really was the collective of Indigenous people, whether Northern or Southern, that actually help foster my ability to reconnect and actually be proud of what my heritage was. When I went back to Central America and reconnected with a couple of point people out of that community, when I went there, was up in the mountains, and I did like a 4-hour bus ride up, and oh my God. And so I thought the bus was going to go into a river. It was like, yeah, it was intense. But when I got there, there was about 300 people waiting for me to get off that bus, with all our prayer flags and ribbon flags. The drums were there, and I got off the bus with my backpack, and the first line of people that greeted me were the grandmothers. Man, and they one of the main matriarchs there, grandma, she came up, and not my grandma, my grandmother died years ago, but she came up to me, and she grabbed my hand, and she said, "We've been waiting for one of our grandchildren to come back, come home to help us. We don't have anything, but everything that we have is yours. Welcome, welcome, welcome." And the tears were rolling out of my eyes, and the music started playing, and the drums were playing, and all these children and the grandfathers and the grandmothers were just grabbing me and just walked me all the way down to the ceremonial house. And the first thing they did was kneel me down and began the reinitiation into the community ceremony. And it was an amazing journey, right? And from that point on, you know, one of the things that they asked me was like, name all your grandparents. You know, luckily I had been memorizing all of them. So I had about 20 names. I can go back about 20 names. And it was, and they're like, oh, we know that name, you know. So it was interesting. And, but that's been the process that was the process, right? And even relearning my language, like my great aunt knew a few phrases and words, and, you know, and what does that mean? And I would talk to maybe Mexican folks and say certain things in Poton, and they're like, what the heck is that? And they're like, that's not Spanish. And I go, what, oh, like, what is that? You know, I was a kid, you know, but that at that point, you know, sort of going back every year and spending time and the first thing that one of the elders said, you want to relearn the language? And I said, absolutely. He said, the first thing you do is do a prayer in our language. That's what you do first, a prayer in our language. And then from then on, things will open up for you in terms of the understanding of the language and reconnecting that way, you know, as part of this, you know, resiliency that we're talking about. So since then sort of, you know, not only reconnecting with my people, with the community, and the responsibility that has been given to me. They gave me my ribbon staff, you know, to represent them here in California, and you know, be able to speak on behalf of the Poton Lenca community here in the United States, in all of the United States, is a great honor. And but I would say that as many degrees or whatever, you know, sort of certificates or whatever that I might be able to get within this colonial framework, there's elders that don't know how to read or write, but they still sign with an X or a thumbprint, but have the mastery and the intelligentsia of anybody in the academic world and beyond, let me tell you. So I want to maintain that level of honoring my elders and all elders across Indian country, from any nation. You know, those that still have that that knowledge and that wisdom. And I say this not in a romantic kind of Dance with Wolves kind of way, but like but authentically, they really do have it, and is the best way that I can explain it to you. So anyways, thanks for the question. I don't know if that answered your question.
That's great. Thank you. We're making us cry over here a couple times. So yay. Thank you.
Stephanie has a question. David, thanks so much for all of the sharing, and I have some reflections and some questions, and hang on, I'm going to put my hand up. There we go. So feel free to take on one or none or some. So the first is that I just want to reflect back that what you're saying about sort of the problematics of Latino or Latinx identity or identities as an umbrella term is seems so important in terms of the identity being identified with coloniality and colonial history rather than sort of a place of origin. And I guess it, you know, it sort of makes me think about then, you know, what does one do? How does one approach naming with Indigenous folks? Is Indigenous an all right term? Native American, American Indian, tribal names? How would you encourage people to be sensitive about naming, I guess? And then the second question is, you know, about what were you, you were saying that about the problem of even being considered human. And I'm sort of wondering in terms of ongoing discussions and problematics of voting, right, and having a voice, how much is there some sort of residue, or, you know, are there residual notions within the American psyche about humanness or non-humanness that then interfere with recognizing the importance of Indigenous people voting in this country? And then I just have two more questions, so more to kind of think about. So one is on kind of the difference between colonialism and settler colonialism. So you talked about what happens when empire is there and then leaves, but the psychological and physical and governmental and language structures are still there. But what if they never leave, right? And so how do we talk about settler colonialism and settler colonialism being an ongoing structure that pervades relationships and pervades identities, and also pervades, and here's the last component of it, the very structures that continue to be resident. And so here's my final question, and that is that, can an entity engage in a process of reconciliation with the people who have been oppressed if that entity cannot recognize or will not recognize or hasn't yet recognized the settler colonial structures that it continues to abide by, even internally within itself?
It falls back to colonial. That's the issue of coloniality. The coloniality is embedded, not only structurally, but in the psyche of those that are in the authority positionality of those structures, right? So so can there be reconciliation, or, you know, with structures that still do not recognize? Well, it can there? I doubt there can be, really authentically, right? And that's why why these talks are important, because it begins to flesh out the need for ongoing education. And I would say that, you know, the socialization, see, coloniality is part of the socialization of all of society. So if that socialization is embedded at a young age, they grow up to be senators and congressmen and educators, et cetera, right? And so there it is, right? So I think, and I want to be hopeful. I really do want to be hopeful, and not end this chat with negativity. It's never going to happen. I think that I am hopeful about us as humans, as human beings, that we can get there together. We need to continue to bring forth, right, the consciousness, which leads me to this. So that leads to the consciousness of what term to use, right? So it depends on, just like, and I've talked to you, you know, whether if you're in Canada, Aboriginal or First Nations in the United Nations, are you kidding? The term Indigenous was debated back and forth for such a long time, let alone the S on peoples. That was debated, the S, because the nation state said, no, just keep them in one monolithic people, monolithic sort of notion, just like Latino and Hispanic is. So getting the S on peoples, Indigenous peoples, was a struggle in and of itself for one word, one letter, because it had huge ramifications. So in terms of the naming, right? Everybody is politically conscious at a different, everybody's different, in a different state of political consciousness, right? Which also means, what level of coloniality has permeated our psyche, right? That then we feel comfortable with saying, I am native, I am indigenous. The term indigenous, again, was debated. Many people did not want that. They wanted First Nations, they wanted Aboriginal, they wanted, so it's really a flexible, I would say, for me, it's flexible notions, right? Flexible identities, right? If it, for some folks, if it makes it easier for them to call me Salvadorian, I go with the flow. I'm not going to argue with them, but yeah, I'm Salvadorian and indigenous. Oh, okay, great. I get it. So I have to understand, as almost a scholar, that everybody's on either end of the spectrums of all this entire spectrum is going to be at different levels of understanding, the historical narratives, the historical traumas that have occurred, right? So, and for me, it's not a gotcha situation. It's really, for me, I've always been an educator, and I'll always be an educator in any, whether it's San Quentin Prison or the correctional facility here in Sonoma County where I work with these young people. We meet people where they're at. I would say there was one thing about, I know we're going to end here, but if you look at, you said something about the American voting system, and I listened to this individual who was our former president, who was in my face, and the debate between Sepulveda and Las Casas was taking place as he noted that these people are animals. Did he say that? Didn't he say that? In one of his speeches, the former president said, these people are crossing our borders and they're animals. The debate of Las Casas and Sepulveda, once again, the head of that debate rised during that speech, right? And where it was clearly noted, these people are animals, right? Unconsciously, maybe, or consciously, I don't know. But I wasn't looking at the former president, just obviously critically, but I when he said that, it just prompted me to say the debate that took place almost 400 years ago has risen again, right? And so, and based on that, was elected to the presidency, right? So, but I'm hopeful. I think that our work as all of us that are on the screen here, we are a collective. We have to be continuing to strive to educate, to continue to be, whether you're an indigenous person or not. Just, I would say, one elder said, at one point the whole world wore feathers, so we're all indigenous people, but our value system at some point shifted, and the disconnection to our own indigeneity happened at some point. Some of us are luckier that are able to reconnect quicker and more intimately now, but there is hope, and we have to be those flowers that pop up in the concrete.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. So I think we will end here. Is there, just before we all go, is there an action step or action steps that you think for people who are overwhelmed by the structure that we cannot overturn immediately? What are action steps I would suggest for beginners?
Yeah, well, so so I think really, and that's what I didn't want to do, but maybe they are overwhelmed by it. But I think that we have just what I said on the note of education, education and connecting and asking the local indigenous communities, what is it that we can do together collectively to assist in your resiliency in terms of your gaze toward the structural? How can we help with that? That would be sort of a real simple kind of just ask the people.
Thank you, David.